So when we encounter the Dharma, all of us come to it, and we're looking for different things. Some people are looking for a worldview, some people philosophy, some people want to learn to meditate, some people want to learn how to handle their emotions. You know, people may have different things that they're coming to look for. But you all get this whole smorgasbord of different kinds of teachings, different kinds of practices, and furthermore, you get your buttons pushed. Right? You get your buttons pushed? Does Dharma push your buttons? It better push your buttons, okay? When we come to the Dharma, we're not looking for something that pushes our buttons. We're looking for something that takes our buttons away. You know, like some kind of magical pill. Get rid of my wrong conceptions. Get rid of my anger, you know, like this. But actually, in order to get rid of these things, our buttons have to get pushed, and we have to notice them. Yeah. So we're put in the position of having to notice things about ourselves that we would rather not notice, or rather not admit. Yeah. And that can be a little bit uncomfortable, you know. But this is the way we learn and grow. I mean, I know at the beginning, it was real uncomfortable for me to even admit how much anger I had, you know, because I was completely convinced my anger was because of other people's stupid things. And my anger was justified, and their anger, of course, was wrong. Yeah, so it was a real button pusher to like, oh, I've got to take responsibility for my own anger, you know. But then other people may have their button pushed in a completely different way, you know. Some people come in with a very materialistic view of things, and then they start hearing about the brain and the mind, and they're not the same thing. And they go, what do you mean? There's only the brain, you know. What's in here? If you can't measure it by scientific instruments, it doesn't exist. You know, and if it isn't something that science can investigate, then what's the use of knowing it? You know, how is it even a knowable object? And your buttons get pushed, yeah, because you hear about mind and subjective experience and how the mind creates the world and the influence of our karma, our past actions, how our actions influence our experiences, and you know, and we're going, no, I just want scientific causality. You're talking about karmic causality. I just want scientific causality that you can duplicate in an experiment. But of course, what experiments can always be duplicated exactly 100%? You kind of get them approximate. So, you know, people get their buttons pushed in very different ways. And this is all a part of learning the Dharma, and it's not something to shy away from. It's something to say, oh, you know, look, there's new things for me to learn. There's new ways for me to look at things. Sometimes we're not even aware that we have a certain viewpoint on life until Dharma comes about with the opposite viewpoint. And then we're going, you know what? Like I remember when I went to, I was living in Nepal and India. I was brought up American, and you know, we're brought up democracy is the one and only right way to do things. Everything should be democratic, right? Democracy is the right way. All countries, all institutions, everything should be democratic. And then I went into, you know, live in Tibetan society, and they don't believe that. You know, they don't believe that democracy is the right way. And we were brought up to think, oh, people who don't believe in democracy, they're just, you know, back with the cavemen. But here I saw society. I mean, His Holiness is getting them used to democracy now. But, you know, here was a society that had its own way of functioning, its own way of doing things, and it worked for them. And it wasn't based on democracy. And I couldn't trash it. you know? And it was all of a sudden for me of like, oh my goodness, I have this whole preconception about democracy is the best way. But you know, democracy only works in certain situations when people were brought up in a certain way with a certain, you know, with certain amount of, what's it called? Ability to read. You know, you have to have a literate society. You have to have a society with certain things, and there democracy works. Except, you know, these society didn't have it, yeah. But they managed, and they worked very well. And then I come home and I look at our democracy, and our Congress is totally dysfunctional, isn't it? Right now, I mean, the Congress we have now completely doesn't function. And yet we're saying democracy is good. So what I'm getting at is like to have a very big mind, and I'm not saying I'm communist, don't get me on the McCarthy list. You know, and I'm not advocating Al-Qaeda. You know, as soon as you say something against democracy, it's like, you know, who are you anyway? But I'm just saying, you know, it's like you have to see the society and what's going on to see what works there. But what I'm getting at is we may come in to Buddhism with certain expectations and our own preconceptions of how the world is and what exists and how things should be done. And then we'll find that, you know, either the Buddhist approach doesn't match that, or if we're in Tibetan Buddhism or Japanese or Chinese or Vietnamese or Sri Lankan or Thai or whatever, that some of the cultural things that go on, you know, because Buddhism always exists within a culture, that those cultural things don't match, you know, kind of what we want and how we like it. So for me, I think this thing of getting put up against my expectations and my ingrained assumptions about the world is very, very useful. You know, it's kind of painful and it can be very confusing, but I think it's very useful because in the end, as you work through it, your mind expands and you become, you can see things from multiple viewpoints, and you become much more tolerant of different people's ways of doing things. And you even discover sometimes that maybe some of your assumptions weren't right, you know? And so you start having a different way of thinking. And I think that's quite helpful, you know? And as Westerners coming into Buddhism, this is especially the case for us. I think many people who are brought up in a Buddhist society, they may not have as many buttons pushed because they just grew up with certain beliefs. But sometimes not having your buttons pushed can be a disadvantage because you never question those things. You never learn them deep enough. Whereas if your buttons are pushed, it makes you question and you go in deeper. So for example, I had a Tibetan friend who was translating, and he told me that, you know, because he was Tibetan, he grew up with the whole idea of taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. Nothing new, they did it all the time. But it was only when he started translating for Westerners, and Westerners started asking questions like, well, what does refuge mean? And, you know, how do we know we can trust the three jewels? And who, you know, who are the three jewels exactly? He said only when he began translating for Westerners did he really himself start learning more about what the three jewels were and what refuge meant. And that really changed his own practice, yeah? Because he had to go, these Westerners were asking all of our incomprehensible questions. But he had to go to the Geshis with them and ask the Geshis these questions, and of course the Geshis answered them, you know, and he said, oh wow, I never understood that before, yeah? So, yeah. So there's nothing wrong with, you know, getting challenged. I think it's good for us.